Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Syngenta Canada, Alberta Wheat Commission, and C&M Seeds.
I'm Lindsay Smith with RealAgriculture.com. I'm joined today by Rex Newkirk. He's the VP of Research and Innovation here at SIGI. Welcome here, Rex.
Thank you, Lindsay.
All right, so big topic. We're talking protein.
Of course.
In wheat. What is protein? How does it relate to wheat and wheat quality?
Great. It's a big deal. Protein is what makes wheat functional. It's the difference between wheat and rice. Rice is starch. Wheat has protein in it, which gives it functionality that allows it to create breads, to create products that stay together when we're fermenting. And so it's the building blocks of the whole machinery, and it's really important.
So explain to me, and we'll maybe get some visuals for this too, what does protein do in an end-use product that wheat is used for?
Sure. What it does is it creates a matrix. So when the gas is forming during the fermentation process, that it allows the material to expand and but still hold. So that way when you look at a loaf of bread and you look at the little holes in there, imagine all the stuff around it. Something has to keep that from just exploding, and that's the protein. But it has to be the right kind of protein, and that protein is gluten.
Okay. So, and that's one of the questions. So is gluten protein and protein's gluten, and are they all created equal?
No.
Oh no.
No. Protein's our way of measuring how much gluten is in there, but protein is a broad category. And as a matter of fact, if you take ammonia fertilizer, it's like 225% protein, because protein is simply nitrogen times a multiplier. And it's a way of measuring this stuff that we find in our cells we call protein. So when we talk about a protein number of 13.5, it's nitrogen times 6.25, and this comes up with your crude protein number. When we talk about gluten, the majority of the protein in wheat, thankfully, is gluten. And it's the type of gluten, it's the structure of that gluten that's so critical to us. And so you can have lots of non-gluten protein, or even a type of gluten that's not functional. And so you can have a really high protein number and have really poor quality. Or you could have low protein and you could have very high quality.
Right, and so that sort of brings us into, so there are several kinds of protein then in wheat. Mm-hmm. And how do you determine what's a low quality protein and a high quality protein?
Well, there's several ways of measuring it, but for us, really, it comes down to functionality. We take the wheat, turn it into flour, and then we look at the functionality of that material. We put it on a machine and we measure how well does it hold together. And we'll take a video of there's something called an extensograph, where they make a piece of dough, let it sit for 135 minutes, and then they measure how far they can pull it and how much pressure it takes to pull it, and that measures your protein strength. So rather than going into sort of the fancy of different protein types of stuff, let's measure, see how it works.
All right.
And that's the best way.
That brings us into, of course, so we know that we can measure percent protein.
Yes.
And we also know that we have different wheat classes, and in those wheat classes, some tend to have a higher, some tend to have a lower.
That's right.
But some can have a low protein but very high quality.
Absolutely.
So how do classes sort of play a role in all that?
Right. So what we do is we know it's impossible to measure every sample of wheat for the quality parameters that we need. So in Canada, we've got a very unique system in place whereby we separate out the wheat that we grow into different classes based on their functionality of that protein and the quantity of that protein. And the number one wheat we grow in Canada is CWS. That's the largest volume, the most well known around the world, and that particular wheat has been selected for the right balance, the right type of proteins to meet the many customers' needs, but it's also selected to have a high protein. And we also have other classes of wheat that have less protein but have very good functionality. And so something like a CPS, for example, CPS Red, it's got some excellent functionality, very good gluten, but it's lower protein content. But unfortunately, when a baker is buying flour, they're buying it in protein content. So they look at their flour, and instead of going out and doing a bunch of measurements on it, the easiest measurement is protein. So when they're buying a flour and they say, okay, it's got to be 13% protein, regardless of what the gluten strength is and the other parameters, if they are strictly used to buying a 13%, they're not going to buy a winter wheat flour that is, or a CPS that's much lower. So we have many different classes, and they have many different functionalities, and they have so we keep our wheat separate based on what we can use it for, and that's part of that is the protein content.
So now, so it makes sense then, sort of, we have to sort of draw a line in the sand, right? Of when an end user is buying, it's a parameter they can buy on. Certainly there are questions, how does something like falling number play into this? Because there are a
that's
few
a great question.
confusing things around falling number. What is it? How does it relate to protein, if at all?
Sure. So falling number, unfortunately, is often thought of as something that would give you the ultimate value for wheat, and unfortunately it doesn't. Falling number, all it does is it measures the amount of sprouting wheat has incurred. If wheat starts to sprout, it kicks out an enzyme called alpha amylase, and you can't even see this stuff. It's just a tiny amount. But what it does is that alpha amylase chews up the starch. And so when you go to make bread, you have a whole bunch of sugar being formed by this alpha amylase, and that'll cause strange colors, it'll cause excess gas formation, and you get just a mess. So what happens is you set minimum parameters on falling number to make sure you don't have that sprouting. In Canada, we use a visual system to determine sprouting rather than falling number. And one of the reasons for that is that we have a very strict system, but two, we don't tend to have an awful lot of sprouting. If you're from another market where they have sprouting all the time issues, for sure they're going to measure falling numbers. That's just a key parameter. But in Canada, we'd find that 95% of the time, our wheat's going to meet the falling number requirement. But it doesn't relate at all to protein quality. It just relates to how much of this enzyme is there and what does it do to the starch.
Okay, and as you explained off camera, sprouted wheat is super good for some livestock.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Interestingly enough, the sprouting is bad for us if we're trying to bake with it because you create all these sugars and you get all this excess fermentation and everything else. For livestock, however, that alpha amylase helps break down the starch so they can digest it faster. So it's actually a preferred product for livestock.
Okay, so that's good to know. Now, last question. This year, of course, we had a lot of crop that stayed in the bin much longer than we wanted it to. Should we be worried about protein changing, levels changing, or the quality changing in the bin, good or bad?
It's actually good. The protein levels shouldn't change much.
Okay.
It's not often we have to store wheat for a long time, but we've worked with customers around the world that have had to store wheat for lengths of time. And one of the issues we've faced recently, some of our gluten strength and our key class has been challenging. We've had some customers complaining about it. And one of our things we've been looking at is what happens during storage. And the good news is gluten strength increases with storage. And to get a little complicated on you, the reason for that is it oxidizes. And when the protein oxidizes, it tends to bind better and it makes a better protein that can hold those things. So it's actually, the old crop wheat will be stronger than the new crop. It gains strength every month.
Okay, so we're not going to lose any protein. Now we may lose in quality parameters in other ways.
If it's not stored correctly. If it's stored correctly, we'll lose nothing.
Yeah.
If it's stored too long, and we're talking multiple years, you can start actually losing falling number. Or your falling number can get too high, you lose the enzymes. But we're talking 1 year carryover. And as long as it's stored dry, I don't think we'll see any depreciation of quality.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.